Welcome to another episode of Autism Spa Podcast, hosted by the Autism Innovation Lab. I am Shahriar Afshar, the CEO and founder of Autism Spa and Autism Innovation Lab. I'm here today with Giacomo Vivanti, a tenured professor at Drexel University, and also the program director of the Drexel Autism Center. Uh, really, Dr. Vivanti has done so much great work in this space, and especially focusing on the practical applications of research in the clinical environment to the real life community that our families are struggling with every day. I connected with him recently and I said, you got to come to our podcast. You got to tell us about your area of research. And we would love to figure out how families and investors and researchers can support your work because I feel like your success is our success. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Giacomo, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Shahriar. It's a privilege to be hosted by your podcast. So, my research is really about understanding how we can improve the well being of children and adults on the autism spectrum and their families. And when I'm talking about well being, I'm not talking about behavior change in one specific domain or gaining some IQ points. I'm talking about things that enable for a high or a reasonable quality of life. And this comes from my experience of growing up with two brothers who are autistic and they have high support needs. So one question that I'm really focusing on is when we implement what we call evidence-based practices in early intervention. So we diagnose children as early as possible. We have services that are designed to support the acquisition of new skills, communication, play, and all of that. Let's imagine a best case scenario. You tick all the boxes, early diagnosis, you have services that provide early intervention. Is this going to make a difference for all children? And the answer to that question is that what we're doing, even in the best case scenario, is not enough. There are some children who stay behind. They do not acquire skills that are important, like verbal or nonverbal communication. And so part of what I'm doing is to focus on those children, the neglected end of the autism spectrum. They do not seem to respond as optimally as they should, even when we are implementing best case scenario evidence-based practices. And then we have another question, and that is, what are the barriers to implement those practices in from an administrative, from an implementation perspective? Finally, and this is something I'm particularly invested on, the older age. This is the most neglected area of the spectrum. Autistic adults who are 50 in their 50s or in their 60s, parents are not around or they're too old to have a meaningful um, role in the management of their care. What are their status? Where do they live? What are the health outcomes in this population? So we're partnering with residential programs in this area to learn about the range of needs in the area of physical and in the area of mental health as well. And what we're learning is that we need way more focus on this area. The needs in this area are absolutely unmet by current policies, by current practices. There are not even guidelines for practitioners, clinicians, service providers, legislators who need to, make decisions about investing in this area. There's no guidelines. So this is uncharted territory. So although we know well, we know a lot about autism in the sense that academia produces a lot of research papers, but there are areas in this field where we know very little, and this is what I'm trying to do: is to shed some light on those areas.
Wow. Wow. All areas that I'm very interested in, and we'll get to the housing part, my favorite topic at the end. But, those that first foundational issue that you mentioned, that evidence-based programs don't work for everybody. In essence, ABA doesn't work. I mean, I never put down ABA. Every time I challenge some therapists for my son, or I question it, people say, well, it's not working because they're not doing it right. Okay, so I get it. But still, statistically, if I'm wrong and correct me, um, ABA only works for what, 12, 15, 16% of some small minority of the population. Uh, a lot of kids, like my son, who's 18, who's nonverbal, who would get diagnosed with intellectual developmental disabilities because he cannot communicate, because he can't take the appropriate tests that are given him. How should families, how should research, how should policies support those alternative uh, methods that I hope can help families when evidence-based doesn't do it? I mean, what are the options then?
Absolutely. So I think the starting point is to document this phenomenon. And the problem is that when we look at clinical trials, what you see is the average gain for a group of children or participants in the study compared to the average gain in a specific outcomes for children who maybe were on a wait list and maybe they received some kind of different intervention. That tells you something. That tells you that if we do see a difference, we can, reasonably expect that overall doing that intervention might be better than doing nothing, than doing the alternative. That doesn't tell me anything, though, in terms of what is the likelihood that my son, that my brother is going to have a positive um, response to this intervention. And so the way I'm looking at data now is to look at proportion of, let's call them responders and non-responders. It's a different approach. Instead of asking, is this working in average? We're asking the question, does it work for 100%, 80%, 60%? Asking this question does not mean that we are delegitimizing or even questioning the evidence base for ABA or other intervention. We're just asking a different question. Even if it was working for 99.9% of children and there was one child who was not benefiting from this approach, it's an important question because the reality for that child is that we need to think um, what are their needs. So at this point, uh, what is very important is for those who are involved in service delivery and research to keep individual differences on their radar, to start documenting who are the children for whom we're seeing a suboptimal response. And we cannot blame the child. We cannot say, oh, child is not learning, is not acquiring spoken language, is not acquiring skills because the child is too impaired or because the child is too difficult or because in that particular service it was not implemented in the right way. I think this is the wrong mindset. In the right mindset is where is it that these specific intervention practices did not meet the needs for this particular child or family or intervention context. Let's shift the burden from the child and the family to the intervention. What is it that the intervention is not doing that meets the needs for this person? And then we can think about augmented versions, adding intervention practices that come from a different approach to the current practices. There's a lot of things that we can do, but we can only do them if we start by acknowledging that the standard version might work for most or many, doesn't mean that it works
No,
for all.
right,
And
right.
so we need to address the needs for those who are not,
It,
who do not deserve to stay behind.
and the challenge, at least as one consumer of that those services, is, well, insurance and schools and institutions only cover ABA. They're not in the experimentation and innovation business. So families are often, I feel, left to on their own devices to go over here for oxygen therapy, go over here for leucovorin, go over there for some other thing, which they have to then, to be honest, argue with their in California, the regional centers for coverage, insurance companies, institutions, the IEP. I feel like families are alone in this unless, as you say, the policymakers and the institutions and the social infrastructure that we're all a part of begins to allow for alternatives to supplement uh, the insurance covered business, right?
Absolutely. I think the point here is that research needs to engage with the needs of people, and particularly unmet needs. This reality of families who access some early intervention practice or school age, it doesn't need to be early intervention. And then children do not make the gains that are expected to make. What's next? That is a research question. That is a does needs need to be documented. How many families have this experience this situation? 1%, 20%, 50%? I don't know, because if you don't do research, you don't know the answer to those questions.
Mm.
If it's a sizable amount of families, then we really need to identify the gaps. Okay, what are the needs that these families are expressing? For example, finding ways for their child to communicate, find a way for the child to have a better emotional regulation or uh, response to sensory stimuli. Identify those needs, and then are there available evidence-based practices that address those needs? Maybe the answer is no, there's not sufficient evidence. Okay, then we need to do research on that so that there is an evidence base. It seems like what is missing here is to get the ball rolling with addressing those questions, perhaps due to the fact that it is already a remarkable achievement that there is access to some evidence-based practices. It was not the case until a few decades ago, but now that we do have um, a more nuanced understanding of individual differences in intervention response, it's time to evaluate a range of interventions that are informed by the needs of families and children.
Right. Uh, let's let's talk a little bit about the policy environment because that is driving research funding, and that obviously trickles down to what institutions like Drexel and others are able to do. I've been involved in many conversations with scientists around the country, and they're all worried about research. There's all commenting about shifts in funding policies that is driving their research. Tell us a little bit about that environment and also any philanthropic supplements because government funding can't do it all.
Yeah. So first of all, I am, I guess, part of the um, group of scholars who are concerned about shifts in the agenda from NIH. Most of the work that I'm doing is funded by NIH.
Mhm.
The point is, we need research that is focused on services and supports. We need research that is focused on populations with unmet needs, for example, older individuals. And it seems like the focus NIH is shifted towards a different question, which is causation. For example, do vaccines cause autism? And a lot of people like myself are. I don't want to get into the debate around vaccines, but the point is we need to do research that help children and adults on the autism spectrum now. We need to ask questions about the services and supports. Now, are, is what we're doing sufficient? Are there unmet needs? Or do we have policies that support things like transition from the school system to the employment system? And if we do have policies, do they work? Do they work for some? Do they work for most? We don't know the answers to those questions. And if federal funding are not interested in addressing those questions, yes, that's where philanthropic organizations could have a role. I do some of my research is funded by the Autism Science Foundation. That's an example of we had a question about understanding the medical and psychiatric co-occurring conditions in individuals who are uh, residentially served, for example. That's the kind of research that NIH did not seem to be particularly interested in addressing. So we're looking at these different options. But generally speaking, we cannot put all of our money into figuring out what possibly causes autism. We need to think about autistic individuals and their families now,
Right.
and that means a shift in our mindset.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. And on that point of, you know, causation, I can tell you, I remember as a young parent 18 years ago, 17 years ago, I can't deny that I asked, my wife and I asked that question of ourselves, what happened? I mean, we didn't, you know, we didn't have necessarily labeled autism family members. I mean, we spent years, but early on, I decided I can just, it's not scientific, but I decided, you know what, we can't waste energy on that. We have to focus on how to help our kid be the best he can be, whatever that is. And that takes a while. I'm not saying every parent will go, I feel like it's an arc. Everyone goes through their own arc. My arc was, you know, a few years in the beginning. Other people are going through a 50-year arc, 60-year arc, maybe still struggling with different issues. But definitely, I couldn't agree more uh, about focusing on how to make life better. That's really, I think, the role of society and government, and ultimately parents. Um, let's focus on housing, the 800-pound gorilla in the room, because you know, you mentioned adults, and this is fascinating. I was being interviewed by a media person one time, and I mentioned housing and how we have to find housing for adults. And she kind of took a step back. She didn't really realize that this is the problem. And I've talked with policymakers, politicians, and they keep bringing up adult, especially severe, the ones that need a lot of support. Lifetime housing is an infrastructure model we don't have in this country. I mean, we have senior housing. People understand senior housing. They understand all kinds of other, as you call it, neglected, marginalized, vulnerable community housing, veteran housing, but adult autism housing, that was new information to a lot of media and policy people. So tell us a little bit about what you're focused on, and we can maybe finish there.
We're trying to understand referral pathways, like where there are residential programs. Many of them are residential programs that are not specific for autism. Many of them exist depending on specific state regulations. For example, it's easier in New Jersey than in Pennsylvania to be referred to a residential program, really specific idiosyncratic regulations. But clearly, that has nothing to do with the needs of a family and a person. And to make it clear, the way I think about housing is not just about the experience of the family. So, for example, my brothers who are in their 40s, they live with my parents who are almost in their 80s. That is not only obviously scary and from a safety perspective and difficult for my parents, it's difficult for my brothers. Normally, people in their 40s, they don't want to live with their parents in their 80s. So it's desirable for everybody involved that there are options, not one size fit all, but options that are available to support the same kind of trajectory that all individuals have as they age, which is not to live with their parents uh, for their entire life.
Right.
There's a safety component, of course, but there is also an understanding that autistic individuals have the same needs of everybody else, and part of it is to be in a place that they can feel, that they can call home. How do we do that without assuming, first of all, that their parents are eternal and that they themselves don't have the needs that all aging individuals have? The question is, again, it boils down to research. We need to do research on what is a sort of an environment and arrangement where autistic individuals can thrive. What is it that will support their mental well-being, their physical well-being, what are the needs, what is the kind of legislation that supports that sort of um, options that again are going to be different for different individuals. Are there some states or some countries, for example, that do this better than other countries? This is all uncharted territory. Why? Again, because the research that is produced depends on the research that is funded. That depends on the agenda of funding agencies, including federal agencies. And those questions, as you were saying, are not in the radar of people, and often are not in the radar of the autistic, influencers, the ones on TikTok and the ones on YouTube. It's not a topic that people want to engage with. It's not glamorous. It's not particularly, um, leading to more um, visibility if you talk about this. But it's an immense, it's a hidden but very real um, experience for thousands of individuals who are neglected.
I couldn't agree more. And obviously, as we've talked, that's a main focus of us here at the Autism Innovation Lab. We're I'm in touch with dozens of families, parents all over the country that are experimenting with various different housing models, as you put it. Not one size will fit all. For some people, maybe living with or next to their parents for a lifetime is a possibility. For many, it may not be. For some folks that are trying to get their loved ones to age in place, which is a big thing in this community, do they have the room and the caretaking ability for 80-year-old parents? Not possible, not sustainable, to take care of 40, 50-year-old autistic adults. And then state by state, all the programs are a little different, right? And they're not always in convenient areas. One thing I've noticed in this community, parents struggle very deeply with the decision to put their loved one in a home. That is not an easy decision. And to put them in a home that may not be close to them. Equally, I mean, out of state, sometimes it's not. I've talked with parents where their loved one lives in a duplex next door. That's great. Or in a tiny home or a ADU or a granny flat in the backyard. That's great. God bless them. That's good for you. Doesn't work for everyone. And other families I've seen, or autism communities around the country, have banded together to build an intentional community, an apartment complex, some other thing, and then they struggle with the severity of the population they can serve. Typically, it's really difficult to fund those types of communities for the most vulnerable, high support needs. Typically, those homes go to high functioning people that are able to function on their own with a little bit of supervision. So, yes, couldn't agree more. Fundamentally, we have a huge problem in this country. We're not planning for this monsoon of aging caregivers, aging parents, aging adult autism, intellectually disabled or not population, and we need to have a national plan, if not a regional and statewide plan, and each one of them is all different. So we're going to keep talking about this, my friend. Thank you so much for your insights. Whatever I can do to help Drexel and yourself in your research, you can count on me. I'm grateful for your support and what I'm doing as well. So we'll keep talking. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.